Let's talk about the political philosophy chapter of Entanglements, a system of philosophy. Um, I don't think it's going to surprise people who are familiar with my work at all that it's anarchist in orientation, anti-statist. Though I hope using certain historical figures in particular that I develop maybe a more positive vision than I have to some extent in the past. I do start out a bit on the concept of justice. That's an amazingly plastic concept. I mean, it's just kind of variable. I'd say this is true of the term happiness. It's true of the term pleasure. And it's true of the term justice. These are words with very little sense. You get to fill in whatever you like in a way. I think of them as variables, meaning like happiness is a variable, kind of meaning whatever the hell you want. Like what you ultimately want, whatever that might be. Pleasure, let me just say that basing a moral system on pleasure is ridiculous, but also the term just makes a hash of all kinds of human experiences. And I'll just say the idea that only pleasures and pains motivate human beings, I don't think you're thinking clearly at all, okay? That's not true. We have many, many different motivations. You don't have to reduce it to one dimension of motivation. Anyway, those kind of ideas play through the whole book, but or at least the second half. I have a crack at Rawls on justice, and I argue that Rawls's theory of justice is utterly incoherent. Actually, people in his original position would be unable to constitute a state compatibly with his principles of justice, or their own principles of justice, as he thinks that they would select. I'm going to leave that argument aside. I've actually have done it on another video probably, although I give a fuller version here. But what I want to talk about is two basic concepts, basic to my political philosophy for some time. First of all, that the left-right spectrum is a terrible disaster, okay? And that no position that can be located anywhere on the left-right spectrum is a coherent position. And that the whole, as a taxonomy for understanding political positions, it's tendentious and utterly incoherent, okay? And here's why. It opposes, I mean, this is one way to conceive the left-right spectrum. You know, it's a very complicated matter what these things are or what they could possibly be, left and right. But I would say, you know, getting right down to it, often it's state versus capital, left versus right, okay? But here's my principle of hierarchical coincidence, PhD. Economic and political hierarchies tend to coincide, okay? So, if you are an enthusiast for political hierarchy, like virtually all the left since the decline of anarchism in the early 20th century, if we implement your program, we'll create a greater economic hierarchy. Okay. Likewise, if you're an enthusiast for economic hierarchy, like a lot of right wingers or whatever, you know, one brand of right wing thought, an enthusiast for capital, you're going to constitute a vast economic hierarchy that will also be a political hierarchy. Both these positions are oppressive, they're hierarchical, and they're not different. Right, you know, and they're complementary in the sense that you keep building up the state, okay, then you get a backlash where you build up capital or whatever, and it all builds into a gigantic societal hierarchy. I think that the concepts of capitalism and whatever it's opposed to, socialism or whatever, um, if they ever really had a basis in reality, they no longer do. Right? Because I think the system that we face it's not capitalist, it's not socialist. I call it squishy totalitarianism. You could say it's both capitalist and socialist, perhaps. Um, so I'll just give you my little like characterization of squishy totalitarianism. Um, except I went to the wrong page. All right. Squishy totalitarianism. The political, economic, aesthetic, psychological system or syndrome shared in common, for instance, by contemporary China, the European Union, Russia, Iran, and the United States. It's characterized by a complex so-called technocratic merger of state and capital, large-scale mechanisms of subject formation, such as compulsory state education and regulation or monopoly ownership of the media, welfare state or safety net programs that stabilize consumption and render populations within limits secure and dependent, and disempowered, a relative tolerance for some forms of diffuse dissent and scope for individual choice, particularly in consumption, combined with pervasive state and corporate surveillance, overwhelming police and military force and sprawling systems of incarceration, entrenched extreme hierarchies of wealth and expertise, regulation of the economy by monetary policy and central banks in conjunction with banking concerns, an international regime of national sovereignties combined with the international state and corporate mechanisms for the circulation of wealth. All right. Uh, I don't think we're in a capitalist phase anymore. Certainly nothing like a free market or something like that. Capital and monopoly capital, gigantic capital, is utterly dependent on state power. Furthermore, it has been since the beginning. And you'll find this in virtually every scholarly consideration of the history of capitalism. Capitalism arises with the modern nation state and depends on it throughout. It's merely an ideology that capitalism wants free, that is, not state-regulated markets. Right? If you want to think about important moments in the history of capitalism, think of things like the British East India Company. Okay, it's a state-enforced private monopoly or private-public concern. It's been a model for a million different thrusts in colonialism, etc. And same with socialism, where you think you're going to get rid of all like voluntary exchanges or something, or more extreme communist visions and so on. A real clear example of the fact that these categories are, if they ever were more than ideologies, they certainly have no purchase in reality now, is the communist Chinese government. Right? I mean, people used to think it was incoherent that you'd be a totalitarian government and a totalitarian communist government that was also doing go-go capitalism. Right? No, those things fit together perfectly well and coalesce into a truly oppressive system, and I think that's where we're at right now. Capitalism versus socialism, I don't know, man. Like, what is this, 1850? At least people thought that made sense then, or they had some reason to think it made sense then. It certainly makes no sense now. And the whole left-right spectrum is just a mess, and you got to get off it to have any thought at all that's useful politically. All right. And so I quote a number of, I really try, I have a crack at the history of capitalism, I guess, here, and I quote a number of scholars to just that effect. I'll give you just one bit. Michael Bode, in this is a pretty standard work, The History of Capitalism. Bode writes, what one should remember is the importance of the state in the birth and the first beginnings of capitalism. This is linked to the national character of the formation of capitalism. There is no capitalism without the bourgeoisie, which developed within the framework of the nation state at the same time as the rise of nations occurred. Within Europe itself, the primary transforming agent is the state. National unity, currency standardization, juridical coherence, military strength, and the beginnings of a national economy, all these were created and developed by the state, or with the state as an organizing principle, and there's no capitalism without those things, okay? So don't listen to what the capitalists or right-wingers say about what capitalism is. It's insincere and it's false. And don't listen to what the communists and socialists say capitalism is, or when they say that we're still in a capitalist phase, or neoliberalism, or whatever, you know, or late capitalism. It's just a bunch of ideological jive, all right? Like, you press on it for a second and it falls apart pathetically. All right, so that's my rant on that bit. And, you know, so, all right, that's the negative part, I guess, and the descriptive part of where we are now, and also the attempt to destroy the taxonomy of political systems that has existed since the mid-19th century, let's say. That's where you get the left-right spectrum. You might be able to push it back to Rousseau and Burke in the lead up to the French Revolution, but that's, you can't go any farther than that, back than that with the left-right spectrum. And you can't think with it at all. And really, it's an attempt to manipulate people, I think. Rather, these are ideologies, not descriptive or empirical observations. All right. Now, my more positive vision, I put it, okay, so in the early 19th century in the US, or until the very end of the 19th century, or, you know, toward the end of the 19th century, there are no left and right. There's not a single person, I think, that you can comfortably fit anywhere on a left-right spectrum up until 1870 in the US. And so I'm very interested in the political thought that got short-circuited by this conceptuality, this tendentious conceptuality of the left-right spectrum. Stuff that happened before that is more interesting and more likely to be true. So really, one thing I do is just run through a whole bunch of my heroes from early 19th century America. People like Lucretia Mott, Sarah Grimke, Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Lloyd Garrison. A lot of these people had some of the most inspiring and beautiful politics that you will ever run into, right? Many of them were absolute pacifists, as like Garrison as an example, also Lucretia Mott. I mean, she's a Quaker, as am I now, right? And they were feminists, including the men. You know, William Lloyd Garrison, for example, they were anti-racist, they were anti-imperialists, right? All of them, well, I don't know about Emerson Thoreau so much. Well, yes, him too. You know, discussed the beginnings of the rise of industrial capitalism as they saw them and condemned that. Nathaniel Peabody Rogers is particularly clear on that, but many of them were. But not from a left-wing standpoint. That is a standpoint where the only solution is the state, right? Because that's just a formula for extinction. Who invented, who deployed nuclear weapons? Who committed the Holocaust, killing fields? The state. And it will end up extinguishing our species, I predict. The worst idea we ever had, and the last idea, maybe. But anyway, and people can't even think outside it for a second. It's impossible. Human life is impossible without it, they think, which is insane. All right, so anyway, I discussed the politics of these figures. In a way, what I want is a revival of this kind of thought. It's neither left nor right. You know, it has many things that many leftists might agree with. These are the biggest abolitionists of the time, the biggest feminists of the time. Some of them were advocates of things like animal rights. They're beginning to conceive of what we call the environmental movement and so on. But they are anti-statists, every single one of them. They're skeptics about power, not enthusiasts for it. Right? They counsel resistance, but nonviolent resistance. And I think it's a beautiful American tradition, left far behind as we just grabbed a whole bunch of these nonsensical European notions about politics. That's all intensifying now. Left-right spectrum is more intense than ever in people's lives, but it makes no more sense than it ever did. And basically what I want to do is conceive politics in terms of human connections, particular human connections. Right? And so in that sense, and I do try to explore this to some extent, it's an example on the human level of the ontology of the whole book. And I just wish, of course, there could be a lot more peace, and a lot less government, and a lot less oppression. And government will not save you from capital, and capital will not save you from government. Okay, I guess that's it for the series. We have completed Entanglements, and I have completed my system of philosophy. So what do I have left to do? I'm actually quite puzzled about that. I've been oddly at sea since finishing this book. All right. Later on.